Wondering what the F has happened to your body and your life? You're in the right place, my friend. Welcome to Season 3 of Transforming 45, where we dive into the incredible stories of how brilliant humans are navigating the midlife squeeze with courage, passion, and a healthy dose of humor. Don't miss out on any of our heart-led episodes. Hit the subscribe button, leave a 5-star review, and if you're inspired, share an episode you love with a friend. It means more to me than I can express that you're choosing to spend time here and sharing our message of midlife revolution. So let's get into it. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Transforming 45. This week, I am thrilled to welcome Dr. Rebecca Sutherns. She is an author, strategist, entrepreneur, and transitions coach who helps high-achieving women navigate life's toughest transitions. Whether career shifts, an empty nest, or relational challenges, she gives her clients clarity, energy, and confidence by aligning their values with their actions as they reimagine their next chapter. Rebecca, your work is this podcast. So I'm so glad to have you here today. Welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Lisa. I'm really excited to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah. So, Rebecca, tell us, who are you and how did life introduce you to this version?
I have a little sticker that's beside my computer that says that version of me is no longer in print. And I'm currently enclosing it in all the cards I'm sending out to my clients for the new year. And I was thinking about your question because I really resonate with the idea of having kind of the latest version of ourselves and figuring out who that is. And one of the questions I often ask in my coaching practice is kind of, who are you now? And it's easier, I guess, to answer that question in roles. And, I am mom of 4 adult kids. I am Minga or grandma to 2. And I have my own business, have had for 27 years as an entrepreneur. So there's all those pieces. And then I think about it in terms of what I'm good at. And I think that's partly how I would also think about who I am now, what version of me, because I think as we enter midlife, I'm 55, and we're getting better and better at knowing ourselves, right? And so who we are both has some continuity and some change to it. And so I feel like who I am right now, in some ways, is the same kid that I was when I was 8 or 18 or 28, but is also a really new version of myself who is not fully defined by my parenting role, for example, or I'm in a different relationship with my children, with my parents, that kind of thing. And so when I think about the kinds of things that I love to do and I'm good at and bring into a relationship or a space, some of that is really consistent. I've always been somebody with a lot of energy. I've always been kind of a big picture thinker who's really good at connecting dots. I'm good at taking a complex task and breaking it down into manageable conversations and asking good questions about those things. That's been very consistent throughout my life. And yet right now, as I help people explicitly help them reimagine their next chapter, I do find myself sort of moving into a role that felt really uncomfortable for a long time and is starting to feel more me. So I feel like there's kind of some gradual transitions into maybe more of an elder role and sort of, I don't know, wise advisor, but also bringer of energy and perspective and clarity, that those kinds of things tend to have found their way into every job I've had and into all of my other roles. And so that would be some of the continuity that I would see there as well.
I appreciate the way you answered with both roles that I play and then all the other things, right? Because like you said, it's easy to answer with the roles because that's defined. I think it's also what people expect is that, when someone says, who are you? We start by answering with like, what do I do for a living? What is my family role? All of those things. And those are also roles, and which is very different from who we actually are. And I thought it was interesting the way you sort of did the back to what have I always been good at? And that sense of like, what do I connect with from who I was and always has been? and who I am now. And I think that's so much the space that we are in as midlife women. And I think it's a really interesting time to navigate this idea of change because as humans, we don't tend to like it very much. We don't like change very much. Some of us have more comfort for it than others. And there also is this really, and it's something I am like struggling with, not only personally, but as our collective, this idea of, oh, you've changed and that's bad. Or you came into this saying you were going to do or be this thing, but you didn't do that and you were this and you were this thing or you were this way. And I think that is a space that we really need to talk about
Yeah.
because this overarching context of change being bad and, oh, you didn't do, say, be whatever you initially thought it was going to be, like that's actually what shows that we are thinking and evolving and growing and changing humans. So that was a lot of words to say. What are the ways that we can start to get more comfortable, both at an individual and at a collective level, around this idea of change?
I have a friend named Lisa O'Neill who lives in New Zealand, and she wrote a book called Everything You Want. And maybe we can talk about wanting later because it's a tricky topic at this time of life, probably for many of us. But one of the things I love about Lisa is she tells a story of a friend who said to her, "Oh man, you're really different than you used to be." And her answer is, "Well, I should hope so," you know. And I love that because I love trying to surround myself with people that are open to changing and open to their friends and their family members changing and having scripts that are loosely held. So I do appreciate that. And I think the other thing is that often our posture toward change is a function of expectations. And I notice myself and others often kind of using some variation of a storyline of when things go back to normal, I will, when the dust settles, I will. And I think it's kind of flawed logic in the sense of things aren't going to go backwards. They're not going to settle down. If we can think about change as the norm, not meaning that something is wrong or necessarily seeing disruption as problematic, but recognizing that I think about it a little bit like surfing a wave, right? There's a wave and there's another wave, and it's not, you don't wait for the sea to be calm. You figure out how to surf those waves, and some are big and some are small and whatever. But I think an expectation of stasis, an expectation of calm and predictable and normal, that sets us up for a problematic relationship with change because we see it as an exception. We see it as a negative disruption. And I think if we can see it as sort of the norm and the way life is and what living, growing, breathing things do, and then approach it in that mindset, we will be better able not to be disappointed by it or frustrated by it. It can still be challenging, but choosing to come at it as a normal and growth oriented thing without kind of swinging the pendulum too far the other way into some weird, I don't know, toxic positive, all change is fabulous all the time and we're supposed to be nothing but happy about it. I think it's a sense of expectation that this is what living things are like and we adapt and figure it out. And so we could certainly talk more about the adaptability side because I do think there's ways that each of us is wired similarly to each other and differently from each other to surf those waves in different ways and drawing on different tools at different times. But I think it starts with our expectations.
Yeah, I think that expectations idea is a really good way to sort of hinge this conversation. I've chatted a little bit, and my listeners will know I've been on quite a journey for the last 6 months or so, where essentially like all the fundamental underpinnings of my life have shifted and
Mm.
changed. And my one of those changes was my father passed away in October, and I was doing some reflecting around things that he always used to say to me. And one of them, like I remember being young and him saying to me, "Oh, you don't like change." And that became the expectation, I think, of my parents for sure, and people who were around me was like, she doesn't like change. And so that became my expectation of myself as well. So through this sort of, I use the word explosive because if anyone listened to my one word 2025, you're going to hear the story again. But this time last year, we went into the woods with some friends and we did a ritual around what our one word of intention was. And my husband's one word was explosion. And I was like, What do you mean by explosion? And he said, well, I think it's time to really shake things up. Well, that became fully manifest in 2024. That is what happened. And I was okay with riding the waves. And as I've looked back at my last sort of 24 months, I left my career as an educator, which had a lot of stability. We've sold multiple property. We moved our home, not only just moving homes, but moving cities. Both my kids went to university. I lost a parent, like all of that within a span of, like, the most intense part was 6 months. And there still was this story, this expectation of, oh, well, she doesn't like change. And it was interesting because there's this like, I'm trying to find the right word for it, resistance, I suppose. This resistance between the truth of, like, actually, all I've done is change over my entire life. And this story of not liking change and wanting to stay in it. And even as, when you were talking about that idea of, well, when I get to a sense of stasis, and I did do that a little bit where, when people were asking me how I was like, I don't know right now, but talk to me in the first 2 weeks of January, which is where we are now, where I finally will have had like a little bit of time to settle. And I think it's that wave analogy of, like, the big tsunami has happened, but now the sense of quiet, now this is what feels like change,
Yep.
because everything has been so, like, in flux for so long. This feels like change. So what are some of the, you use the word adaptability, and I think that's the word for what needs to happen in this time. So what are some of the ways you talk to people around what they need in terms of adaptability and how to apply that?
Yeah, I think understanding kind of I love how you were describing that almost like a picture drawing it, the tsunami came and the calm is now, but it's different and it feels new. And, I think giving people metaphors and images and language that allow us to name and express what's going on is one helpful piece. It doesn't sound like it's enough. And I would say that it isn't probably enough by itself, but it's a really good starting point. And I have this kind of love hate relationship with naming the stages of transitions. There's various people who write in this space of, the endings and then the messy middles and the new beginnings. And that all makes some sense to me experientially, but we also know that it's not linear and that we don't go through transitions one at a time. They don't kind of like start, begin, and end, and one finishes and the next one neatly starts thereafter. They're kind of overlaid on each other. And I picture kind of these sine curves from math or something that are like overlaid on each other. And, you might be at the beginning of one and in just the muck of the fog of another. And, you thought you were coming out the other side, but you've reverted back in because it's not linear. And, so it is kind of a mess. And so I think part of it is giving ourselves some pictures and language around that and having people in our lives that can keep us company in the midst of and let us muddle through trying to put some language to it. I think that's part of it. I think another piece in the data science and behavioral science would bear this out, that adaptability is a set of skills that are learnable. So we are not born adaptable or not. It's something we learn. It's something that as we learn it, we figure out our preferred way of doing it. And the more we can align how we adapt with our preferred pathway to that adaptability, the happier we will be with it. So if we are being expected, even by ourselves, to adapt in a way that's not our preferred way of adapting, we might think we don't like change, but we might just not like that way of changing. And we would prefer to use a different tool in our toolbox to change. So for example, some people, there's various components of adaptability. One of them is grit. So perseverance, kind of doggedness. Some people are really great at that and they find that really easy. And other people find that kind of stamina really exhausting. So if you're not, it's like the equivalent of being an endurance runner or something compared to a sprinter. And if you're a sprinter that's being asked to run a marathon, you're going to be miserable. But if you love stamina sports, grit might be your favorite tool to draw on. For me, it's not. I'm a really I think in big picture terms very easily. And so that kind of big picture thinking, that's a tool I can use to adapt because I can look down the long road and say, where are we heading with this? And I don't have to worry too much about the details of how we get there, how the path kind of changes. I know the destination. Or I can bring mental flexibility to the story and go, I can see lots of different ways of getting to that destination. I don't need to be married to one particular one. But if you're somebody that says, but we have this, procedure manual and I had this script, right? And you were talking about stories from our childhood. If we are clinging tightly to some very early programming or some scripts that have really anchored in us, that mental flexibility might be hard for us. But what we can do is we can lean on team support or corporate support, depending on our work environments and our family environments and the kinds of spaces and teams and groups that we're part of, because adaptability is a team sport in that sense. It's not something we do alone. And so you can imagine if you are supposed to adapt at work and you work in the most like beige, boring, risk averse, fluorescent lit, low ceiling kind of place, your ability to be creative and resourceful is probably more limited than if you're working at an office that looks like Google that has, slides and carousels and swings in it, right? So there's lots of different ways to get good at adaptability. But I think if we can help people understand what those tools are in that toolbox and help them pick the ones that they have an aptitude for, we don't have to be good at every single way of adapting. I think we need to find our preferred ways and live into those in a way that allows us not only actually to adapt, but to like it. Because what the research shows is that people who are adapting in ways that suit them well, like it. They're energized by it. It's not a drag. And so when people are feeling overwhelmed by change, I mean, sometimes it is that we've just maxed out, right? That we've reached our capacity for any given calendar year. But sometimes it is just that we are being expected to do it in a way that doesn't suit us very well. And if we can find another pathway toward it, we can still go to that same place. We've just taken a more comfortable mode of transportation to get there.
Mhm. I think that's a really interesting lens to look through, especially when we're thinking about menopause and its impact in the workplace, right? So we know from the Menopause Foundation of Canada report that 1 in 10 women are leaving the workforce due to unsupported menopause symptoms. And that has both personal and organizational ramifications, right? So when I'm thinking about it as the personal, as the individual one, it can be a time to really sit and think about what is it that I actually want at this phase in my life and at this phase in my career. How do I want this to be? What are the symptoms of menopause and perimenopause that are impacting me? Because that knowledge gap still is a big issue, right? We've got brain fog, word recall, lack of energy, stamina. When you were talking about stamina, this is where I really started thinking about that. Those things are happening in women, and they still don't know because of this information gap that it's actually the physical transformation that is happening in your body through perimenopause and menopause. So we need to know that on the personal level, so we can go, okay, these are the things that I'm experiencing now. If I know that, let's use one example, like one symptom specifically to work around. So let's talk about brain fog. So if I now know that I'm experiencing brain fog because of perimenopause and menopause, what's a way I can talk to my organization about that? Because there's got to be adaptability on both ends of this conversation. And it's not always easy as a female employee in particular to go and speak to my organization, likely, not always, but likely male supervisors and people who are in charge of the organization, and talk about that idea of adaptability of like, these are the things I'm noticing in myself. This is how it's impacting the way I am showing up and what I'm able to do that is different from how I was before. And how do we come together to make a workable solution?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that make it tricky, right? Because, I mean, if we could say, this will last a month and I will be back, it's very different than saying, actually, sometimes it lasts 12 years. So what do you think, right? Because it could be a long term accommodation needed or a short term one. And I know I, at various points in my career, have been very conscious of not wanting to contribute to a story of women somehow being less than in the workforce, right? And, or, yeah, just I mean, there's all kinds of things we could talk about that. But for me, let me bring it back to a different stage in the reproductive health cycle for me, because this came up when I was in my first job. So before I had my children, I was doing a lot of international travel. I still do, but at that time I was traveling primarily to Africa, and there was nothing safe against malaria in the areas I was traveling to that was also safe during pregnancy. So what it meant was that I either had to choose between fully fulfilling my job description as it was laid out or starting a family. And I couldn't do both in a safe, healthful way at that time. And so had to navigate that with my employer. And it's very hard to say to your employer, oh, by the way, I need to stop. I traveled for about 40% of my job. Really hard to say, I need to stop traveling for the next 6 months to clean out my system so that I can start trying to get pregnant, during which time I cannot travel. And by the way, then when I get pregnant, chances are I can't travel then either. And then I'll be on mat leave. And so we're looking at, if I'm lucky enough to be able to get pregnant fairly quickly, a big, long chunk of time that I can't fulfill this role in this way. And in addition to navigating that individually, we were also dealing with it collectively at two other levels. Other people in that same role as me were also women of childbearing age at that time. And so it wasn't only me that was facing this. And also my male supervisor, who was fabulous, said, I don't want to become biased in my hiring in the future in terms of not hiring women of childbearing age into this role because this conversation might repeat itself multiple times. And so I realize I'm speaking about a different phase than menopause, but it's my personal experience of navigating these kinds of conversations with an employer to say, what are we going to do? And it was really interesting because the various women in that position, there were several, each navigated it in different ways, some with greater success than others. And for me, I moved into a non-traveling role, which was a great accommodation for a while, but was also just not nearly as interesting. And so I ended up moving on to other things and going back to school and doing all kinds of other things. And so as I fast forward now 30 years later, I think I'm very conscious of not only individuals being able to have that conversation comfortably and safely, but also what it does to the broader conversation in good and not good ways. Because I think in good ways, it puts things on the table. It makes them explicit. It makes it something that we can talk about at work. And yet I can feel in myself a bit of I don't want to contribute to a conversation that is going to make people all hesitant about having midlife women in the workplace. And isn't that typical of us in some ways to sort of internalize that sort of angst and unwillingness to speak out what we need? And I, again, at the risk of not wanting to sound sort of overly positive about it, I would also wonder, in response to your question of what do we do, I think clarity is kind. I think people need to know kind of what we're at, so thanks to Brene Brown for that idea. But also, I want to be thinking about making sure that my contribution to that workplace is highly valued enough that the accommodations that I might need are no big deal because I am valued highly enough in that space that, that they're willing to make those accommodations and making sure that I am excellent at my job and, stepping into that in a way that I would be sorely missed if I decided to be with that 10% of people that needed to step away. So whether, as I also did early in my career, was negotiating for improved maternity care benefits and pregnancy leave and all that stuff, here I am at a different stage of the reproductive cycle and saying, what does it look like to take collective responsibility for whatever life stages people are in and whatever they need at that time? And I think things like, you and I both live in Ontario, Canada, and I think one of the legislative pieces that we navigate here is called AODA. It's a Disabilities Act. I don't want to imply that menopause is a disability, but I think one of the things that kind of legislation is doing for us in a good way is making the idea of a range of accommodations for a range of situations of people alongside an agenda of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice that says lots of people need lots of different things, and we aren't going to be able to read one another's minds. We need to know what people need in order to set them up for success. And so as women of a certain age get into positions of leadership, sadly not as much as we'd like them to, but as they do, I also think another piece is us making sure that we are good bosses and that we don't kind of replicate a patriarchal system of leadership that didn't serve us well, and that there's no sense of others kind of having to pay their dues, but in fact rethinking what work and work accommodations could look like. And I guess what I'd like to do for this conversation is kind of put it in a different angle of saying, what can our teams and our corporate cultures do to help us, all of us, be more adaptable people? Because I think if we can do that, these kinds of conversations become easier. They're like blinking and breathing. It's not a big deal because we are used to flexing. And I think that's one of the good things that's come out of the pandemic era for some employers, not all, where they are starting to see that different work arrangements can still mean that work gets done, that we don't need to be marking attendance for fully responsible adults, so that there's just lots of other ways to think about it. And I'm certainly learning from my own children in that, because that generation who are now in their 20s are seeing work really differently. And so I feel like there's just lots of ways that we can be learning from others around us and from experiences we've had and from other kinds of accommodations that are needed, without us also living into a self-fulfilling prophecy that doesn't have to stay the same either. So just because I might have brain fog right now does not mean I am going to have brain fog for the next 10 years of perimenopause and menopause, right? So I think we need to be well informed too, so that when we bring it to our colleagues, to whatever level we choose to do that, we're doing it in a way that is really well informed and not framing it ourselves as a, death march or something that is really going to be awful, nothing but awful for the next decade.
Yes, absolutely. And that's the line that I walk in the menopause, perimenopause world, is acknowledging on the individual level. Yes, like these are hard things that are going to happen and they don't last forever. And there are things that you can do about them. And that's a little bit where I worry about that menopause narrative and I think what you were saying, that self-fulfilling prophecy of there's this tension between acknowledging that, yes, this is happening to me, but if I acknowledge it, then it becomes real. And then I'm going to see how it plays out in my world, or I can just keep ignoring it. But the ignoring also means that I am not putting myself in a place where I could have an improved quality of life. And that's the tricky line to walk right now with the level of knowledge and understanding of what's happening at like the collective. And yes, menopause is having a moment where it's in more conversations, where people are starting to talk about it more. And we're still just at the beginning of that conversation. Like there's really so much more for humans and organizations to know and learn and understand. And it's where my brain immediately goes to, and this is why we need policy, right? You were talking about the legislation, yes, and policy, because that's where the clarity comes from, right? When you were talking about your experience with prenatal, very similarly, I was working as a special education teacher, and I had just let my principal know that I was pregnant and I was expecting in January, and this was early June. And it was like maybe 3 days later. And she came, Francoise McLean. Still remember this woman. She was wonderful and a hurricane in diamonds and high heels. I heard her clomp, 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 clomp coming down the hall. She burst open. She's like, Lisa, you need to leave right now. There's a case of foot and mouth in the school, and you have to go. And it was because that policy was so clear of if happens, it's no longer a safe environment for women who are pregnant, and this is what needs to happen next. That policy has changed, but at the time, that is what it was. So because that was so clearly laid out, I actually felt a little bit like I was at the center, the eye of this hurricane that suddenly was happening around me. And I just was ushered out of the building. They're like, we'll bring you your things, go. And it meant that there was not any pressure on me to have to problem solve that situation, which in that moment was an absolute gift. And so the more we can, humans who are in leadership roles right now, do that and think about what is it that I really need right now, and what do I want for those who are coming up behind me, and put that policy into place so that it just, like you said, it just is.
Yep, absolutely. And I love that combination of sort of what the individual needs, what in your case, the school would need, or the school board, or the broader society, right? My brain kind of works at all of those levels at the
Yeah.
same time. And I think that whether it's adaptability or other related skills like curiosity or imagination, those skills all work at all of those levels, right? And so we often think of them as being individual. We're very sort of individually focused in our upbringing and narratives, where at least where I've grown up. And I think if we can flip a script to say, this is a collective situation, a collective responsibility, it's something we can problem solve together, it also takes some pressure off, because it's not only codified in policy, but it's also something that we talk about, as opposed to each individual person having to, sort it out individually. So I'm with you on that for sure.
Yes, because when organizations have the language and know how to infuse that into the culture, it completely changes the expectation, going back to what we were talking about earlier, the expectation and the pressure that I might feel as an individual. And I think that we also need to have some forethought, like you were saying, with the new like Gen Z coming into the workplace and the lived experiences and reality that they have had. It is a very different workforce, and people can get wrapped up in the negative aspects of it. There also are some really incredible positives. It just means, going back to the change conversation, that organizations are going to have to change and be adaptable to actually center the needs of the humanity of the people who are in that organization, which is that is a much more consensus, collaborative perspective on leadership than the patriarchal you do as I say. So it's a real shift, and I think we're feeling the elastic of your book, right? We're feeling that elastic, that stretch feels uncomfortable. And I'm wondering through your experience, like what's some of the potential that you see coming from that?
Mhm. Well, I mean, when I think about let's talk about elasticity for a second, because I think
Mhm.
elasticity requires or something being say you are an elastic to take that metaphor, right? If we are like a rubber band, there's a stretchiness to it. And if you don't stretch, like if an elastic band literally has been sitting on your desk for 6 months, not stretching at all, and then you pick it up and try to stretch it, it's become brittle and it might very well crumble or crack in your hand, right? So there's an element of stretch that we need in order to stay healthy, in order to stay vibrant and fulfilling the purposes for which we were intended. You know, an elastic sitting on your desk is not what an elastic was made to do. And an elastic can lose its effectiveness the other way as well when it either stays stretched for too long, think your stretchy pants during COVID or an old bathing suit or something, right? The elastic just
Mhm.
loses its stretchiness, won't spring back. But also that can happen if it gets stretched too hard too fast, right? If we give it a yank and it snaps for that reason. Similarly, and this is where the metaphor both breaks down but also applies differently to humans than to pieces of rubber, snapping back into its original shape is what an elastic is meant to do. That's what makes it elastic in physics or material sciences. But humans have a choice, right? They have a choice if they snap back into old shapes that don't fit them anymore, or if they say, actually, I am different now. And similarly, if you are an elastic band, if you're like the little tiny kind that I don't know, go in your mouth when you have braces on your teeth, like the little minuscule ones. We had 4 kids in braces at one point, and we used to have hundreds of those things all over our house. That little baby elastic has a lot different stretchy capacity, very little, compared to like a resistance band you would use at physio or at the gym. And each of those has its own properties of how much it can handle. Similarly, humans have that kind of capacity too, but the difference is that we can grow ours. It's variable, right? So we can learn if we feel like a little mini elastic, we don't have to stay a little mini elastic for our whole lives. We can learn skills like adaptability and curiosity that will actually expand our capacity to be elastic, to be adaptable. And so part of the learning process for us as humans is to figure out when we are maxed out because we get stretched in multiple directions. You can picture an elastic band and your fingers kind of pulling it in all the directions. Sometimes it gets snapped because it goes too far one way, but sometimes it gets snapped because there's just too many things pulling on it in all kinds of directions. And for many of us, particularly women, that is our lives, right? So many demands and it's cumulative. And the boundaries between paid work and unpaid work and other parts of our lives don't matter at all because the capacity of any single elastic is any single elastic. But the encouraging message in that is that we can, in fact, grow that. Not because we need to just keep on taking the weight of the world on our shoulders, but because we can decide to learn and get good at this in a way, as I said before, that kind of energizes us. And we can also choose to some extent what pressures and sort of sources of pull we are willing to let in and not. And so I just think there's a lot of kind of ways of playing with that metaphor. And one of the ways that I find useful is to think about if you were going to stretch an elastic, it needs to have some fixed points. It needs to be anchored somewhere. Because otherwise, when you pull something, if it doesn't get anchored in one place, you're just kind of carrying it around. But it needs to stay anchored somewhere so that you can stretch. And I think about that a lot because you need to know where your anchor points are that are not sort of they are the non-negotiables in your life that allow you then to be flexible in some other areas. And it's partly why pandemic life was so hard for many of us. It felt like those anchor points had all given way at the same time and everything was shifting. And so when people are in the midst of transition, which all of us are all the time, recognizing what isn't changing is very helpful. So whether that is some core values that we hold that aren't changing, whether that's relationships that we can count on that aren't changing, it might be skills or places. It could be lots of things. But I think as our brains, as you said, we don't love massive amounts of quick change. And so the more we can have some continuity, that settles our nervous system down enough to allow us to expand and stretch in some other ways. So we aren't good at stretching in all directions all the time, but anchoring in some is helpful. And another way that metaphor works for me is if you can picture stretching an elastic, if that elastic is really stretched and you give it a nick in it, like if a pair of scissors comes along and nicks it partly, it's not going to take much for the whole thing to snap. Right? But if it's got some give to it and you put that same cut in it, it's not snapping because it wasn't under that kind of tension in the first place. And we know this. We know that when we are stretched, it doesn't take much, right? Like our level of irritability, our level of capacity to take on new things is really low. And so the more we are able to leave a bit of buffer in the system, whether that's in our calendar or in our mental state or whatever it is that we need to build some buffer, we are going to be better able to withstand those things that stretch us. And if they hit us at a time when we're already overstretched, we are not going to handle them nearly as well as if we've got a bit of give. And so there's just lots of ways for me that metaphor works really well to think about what it looks like to be optimally stretched, because you want to be a little, but not too much.
Yeah, that's really key, that idea. And especially when we enter into perimenopause and menopause, because we have all the life context things. And then we add in declining estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone, and the way that has a real impact on our capacity for responding to all of the context things in our lives. It is massively energy expensive for our bodies to be going through this chemical transition and have all of the same expectations. And so that's where I really liked that. And it took me back to the beginning of our conversation a bit as well. That idea of having, the anchor points, which are our core values, and all of the rest of it is learning. Right? We are always in this space of and learning, and we have these places that we can anchor into that give us the stability that we need so that we can do that. So I so appreciate that idea and your time and your perspective today. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. Change is the only constant of this phase of life. And this has been giving me a lot of really helpful ways of thinking about that. So thank you.
I'm so glad. I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks so much.
Hey everyone. Thanks for joining me on this week's episode of Transforming 45. I hope you feel inspired, empowered, and ready to embrace every facet of your midlife journey. If you enjoyed our conversation, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review. These actions make a world of difference in growing our podcast community. Your support helps us reach much more amazing listeners just like you. And don't forget, please share an episode you love with a friend or with your community. Sharing our stories is what helps our community grow. Keep shining your midlife magic, and I'll catch you next week. Electricast.